All right, let's dive deep today into the world of Negritude.
Yeah.
And it's going to be quite a journey.
Ah,
So strap yourselves in, get your thinking caps on,
definitely.
because we're going to grapple with some pretty fundamental questions,
Yeah.
about identity, about culture,
Mm-hmm.
about how we see ourselves and how we're seen by others.
It's complex,
Oh, it's so complex.
very multi-layered.
And especially when you bring in this historical context of colonialism,
Yeah,
that just adds another layer of intricacy to the whole thing.
definitely.
So I'm really excited to unpack all of this with you.
Absolutely.
And yeah, let's get right into it.
Okay.
You often hear this phrase, "Who am I?"
Yeah, a classic question.
Right. It's like a classic philosophical question.
Starting point of all philosophy, you could say.
Right. Like almost every philosopher
Mm.
at some point in their life,
It's that quest for self-understanding.
wrestles with that.
Exactly.
And there's this inherent human need,
Yeah.
I think, to try to understand who we are.
It makes sense.
What's our place in the universe?
We want to make sense of the world and our place in it.
But what if we just kind of shift our perspective a little bit?
Okay.
And think about this.
Yeah.
What happens when that question of who am I
Mm-hmm.
becomes who are we?
Interesting.
Right.
A collective identity.
Yeah, a collective identity.
Rather than just the individual.
And specifically,
Okay.
when that we is existing in a world that has historically defined itself
Mm-hmm.
in opposition to that we,
Right.
a white world, so to speak.
In a sense, a world that has often excluded that we from its definition of itself.
Exactly.
It's almost like a double consciousness.
Yeah, you're constantly aware of how you're being perceived
And how you don't fit into that dominant narrative.
while also trying to define yourself
Yeah.
on your own terms.
It's a tension.
It is a huge tension.
Absolutely.
And that's where I think negritude comes in.
Right. Exactly.
Because it's this really potent response
Mm-hmm.
to that feeling of being othered.
To being marginalized, to being told that your culture, your history doesn't matter.
Exactly.
It's about reclaiming that space.
Yeah, it's about reclaiming that space and saying, no, our history does matter.
Mhm.
Our culture does matter.
Our experiences matter.
Our voices matter.
Absolutely.
So with that in mind, how would you define negritude?
It's a complex movement.
Okay.
It was a movement that really took shape in the mid-20th century.
Mm-hmm.
And I think at its core, it was about this self-affirmation
Okay.
by Black people.
Okay.
It was about asserting the value of Black cultures
Mm.
and Black civilizations
Okay.
as a direct response to centuries of colonialism and racism.
Right. It was not just about surviving.
Absolutely not.
It was about thriving.
It was about claiming a space in the world and
Yeah.
saying, we have something valuable to contribute.
And that our contribution
Yeah.
is inherently different. Invaluable because of that difference.
It's not about assimilation. It's
Crap.
about saying we have our own unique perspectives.
So who are some of the key figures
Okay.
in this movement, in this negritude movement?
Well, you can't talk about negritude without mentioning Aimé Césaire,
Okay. Aimé Césaire.
the Martinican poet and politician.
Right.
And then there's Léopold Sédar Senghor,
Okay.
who went on to become the first president of Senegal.
Right.
And then we have Léon Gontran Damas
Okay.
from French Guiana.
Okay.
These three, they were all students in Paris in the 1930s.
Okay.
Imagine Paris in the 1930s,
Yeah.
this hub of intellectual ferment,
Yeah.
and these three young men from different corners of the Black world,
Yeah.
they find themselves together,
Right.
brought together by this shared experience of colonialism.
Right. They're all experiencing this kind of alienation.
Yeah, this feeling of not belonging.
Right. In this supposedly very enlightened,
Yeah,
center of European culture.
but they're constantly reminded that they're not fully accepted.
Right.
They're seen as other.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting, too, that they all had these very different backgrounds.
Oh, absolutely.
They weren't a monolithic group.
Not at all.
Césaire was from Martinique, which had a long history of slavery.
Right.
And then Senghor was from Senegal, which had a different,
Different colonial experience.
right, different colonial experience.
Different traditions.
So how did these different experiences then contribute to the formation of this shared idea of negritude?
It's really fascinating how they kind of coalesced around this idea.
Okay.
Because they were all, in their own ways,
Okay.
rebelling against this idea of assimilation.
Right.
This idea that to be accepted,
Mhm.
they had to completely erase their own cultures,
Right. Become more French.
become more European.
Yeah.
And they were all, in their own way, saying, no, we're not going to do that.
Right.
We're going to embrace who we are.
And what was it specifically that they were rejecting?
Well, For Césaire, he was really disgusted by what he saw
Okay.
as the kind of mimicry of
Mhm.
European culture by the Martinican elite.
Okay.
He called them the colored petit bourgeois,
Right.
and he just found their whole attitude so frustrating.
Right, like they were trying so hard
Yeah, like they were trying so hard to be French,
to fit in.
and he felt like they were betraying their own heritage.
Right, like they were ashamed of where they came from.
And he wanted to shake them out of that.
Wow.
He wanted them to see the beauty and the value in their own culture.
So it wasn't just about rejecting colonialism.
You know, it was deeper than that.
It was about rejecting this internalized colonialism,
Exactly.
this idea that somehow European culture was superior.
And that to be successful, you had to adopt their values and their way of life.
What about Senghor?
Senghor had his own kind of rebellion going on.
Okay.
He talked about how his teachers in Senegal,
Yeah?
they basically told him that he had no culture,
Wow.
that he was a blank slate.
Like a savage.
Yeah, like a savage in need of civilization. And
Yeah.
he was just like, no way.
He's like, I've got a rich culture.
I have a history.
I have traditions.
And he refused to accept that.
You know, I'm thinking about how often
Yeah.
colonialism tried to erase the histories and cultures of the
Yeah.
people it was colonizing.
Absolutely.
And Négritude was like this powerful pushback against that.
It was a reclamation project.
It was a reclamation project, yeah.
It was about saying, no, we're not going to let you erase us.
Now, I know that there were also like divisions within the black world itself.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, created by this whole history of slavery.
Yeah, it's a complex legacy.
And colonialism, right.
Definitely.
Like, for example, you know, someone from the Caribbean
Mm-hmm.
might have a very different relationship to Africa
Yes.
than someone who's directly from the continent.
Right.
So how did Négritude try to bridge those divides?
You know, Césaire was very aware of this tension, and he actually talked about an encounter he had with
Okay.
this young man from the Antilles
Okay.
who was, like, really snobbish.
Okay.
And he was like, I have nothing to do with Africa. Those people are savages.
Wow.
And Césaire was just floored.
Wow.
He was like, how can you deny your own heritage?
So Négritude was also about
Yeah.
reclaiming that connection.
It was about building bridges.
the Africa, right?
Yes.
Even for those who had been, you know, separated from the continent for generations.
It was about recognizing that shared history
Yeah, that shared ancestry.
and saying that despite the differences,
Right.
there's this underlying unity,
right.
this shared experience of being Black in a world that often devalues Blackness.
Okay, so we've got these three young intellectuals in Paris.
Yeah.
They're grappling with these huge questions of identity.
Mm-hmm.
And they're surrounded by this kind of Eurocentric intellectual environment.
Right.
Where were they finding inspiration?
Well, one of the really interesting things is that
Yeah.
they were really inspired by the Harlem Renaissance.
Oh, well, Harlem Renaissance.
which was happening in the United States at the same time.
Okay.
And they were reading writers like Langston Hughes
Oh, okay.
and Claude McKay
Okay.
and Elaine Locke.
Okay.
And they were just blown away
By what? What were they blown away by?
this explosion of Black creativity
Okay.
and this unapologetic affirmation of Black identity.
Okay.
And they saw that as a model.
So they're looking across the Atlantic
Yeah.
and they're seeing this vibrant Black culture
Mhm.
that's not trying to assimilate. That's
Exactly.
not trying to be white.
They're celebrating their Blackness.
Yeah, they're celebrating their Blackness, and it's inspiring them.
And it gave them a sense of possibility.
And it's giving them permission, you know, in a way to say,
Yeah.
like, we can do this too.
Absolutely.
And they're also connecting with this, like, global network
Yeah.
of Black intellectuals.
It wasn't just an isolated movement. It was part of this larger conversation.
You know, and speaking of connections,
Mm-hmm.
we can't forget the Nardole sisters,
Absolutely not.
who played a huge role in fostering this intellectual exchange.
They were absolutely crucial.
Right. They were hosting these salons in Paris
Yeah.
where Black intellectuals from all over the world
Mm.
would come together.
To discuss ideas, to share their work.
And it was in these salons
Yes.
that Césaire and Senghor and Damas
Mm-hmm.
first encountered the works of the Harlem Renaissance writers.
They were the bridge builders.
So their contribution was really essential.
Absolutely foundational.
And yet they're often kind of left out
Sadly,
of the dominant narrative.
they've been marginalized in the historical accounts.
Right. Like so many other women
Unfortunately, that's a recurring pattern.
who are making these huge contributions,
But their voices weren't always heard.
but were not always recognized.
But their impact is undeniable.
Yeah, so we've got to give them their due. Shout out to the Nardole sisters.
Jane, Paulette, and André Nardal, they deserve to be remembered.
Okay, so we've talked about the historical context, the key figures, the influences.
Like cultural ferment.
But now I want to dig a little deeper.
Okay.
Because Negritude wasn't just a political movement or a cultural movement.
It was also a philosophy?
It was a philosophy, right.
Yeah.
So what were some of the core philosophical ideas?
Well, this is where things get really interesting.
Right.
Because Negritude was trying to articulate a different way of seeing the world.
Okay.
A different way of being in the world.
And this is what we're really interested in for our philosophy listeners.
Yes, absolutely.
Right.
It challenges some of the fundamental assumptions of Western philosophy.
All right, give us an example.
Okay, so one of the key ideas in Negritude is this concept of emotion.
Okay.
Now, in Western philosophy, emotion is often seen as something that needs to be controlled.
Right, it's irrational.
It is as irrational.
It gets in the way of clear thinking.
Exactly.
The classic mind-body split.
The Cartesian dualism.
Right. The mind is supposed to be separate from the body.
And the body is seen as this source of unruly emotions.
Right.
But Negritude turns that on its head.
How so?
It says, no, emotion is not something to be feared or repressed.
Okay.
It's a source of knowledge.
Okay.
It's a way of understanding the world.
Now, this might sound a little strange.
I know, right?
To someone who's been raised on Western philosophy.
Which goes against the grain.
Right, where we're taught to value logic.
And objectivity.
And detachment.
Exactly.
But Negritude says there's another way of knowing.
There's a way of knowing that's more intuitive.
Okay.
More embodied.
Okay.
More connected to the rhythms of life.
Okay, so it's not about rejecting reason.
No, not at all.
It's about expanding our understanding of reason.
It's about recognizing that reason can be expressed in different ways.
Right, so it's not either...
It's both hands.
It's both hands.
It's about embracing the fullness of human experience.
Okay, so this idea of emotion as a source of knowledge.
Yeah.
Where does that come from?
Well, Singhor in particular was really influenced by the philosophy of Henri Bergson.
Oh, Bergson.
And Bergson was all about this idea of intuition.
Okay.
This direct apprehension of reality that goes beyond the limits of the intellect.
Right. It's not about analyzing things.
It's about experiencing it.
Feeling them.
Yeah.
And for Singhor, this was a key aspect of the African way of knowing.
He saw this intuitive, emotional way of knowing as being deeply rooted in African cultures.
And he saw that reflected in African art.
Absolutely.
In African music.
In African spirituality.
Now, this might be a good place to mention that, Singhor's ideas about the African way of knowing have been criticized.
Yeah, definitely.
For being essentialist.
Right, for generalizing.
For making these sweeping generalizations.
About an entire continent.
Right, and we definitely want to acknowledge that.
Absolutely, it's important to be critical.
Africa is a vast and diverse continent.
It's not a monolith.
Right.
And there's a danger in reducing all of that diversity.
To a single essence.
And Singhor himself was aware of this critique.
Okay.
And he always insisted that he wasn't trying to create a rigid definition.
Okay.
He was trying to point to something that he saw as a recurring theme in many African cultures.
So it's more about like a family resemblance?
Yeah, like a thread that runs through, but not a defining characteristic.
But not a defining characteristic. Okay.
I think it's also important to remember the context. That Singhor was writing in. He's writing in a time when African cultures were being denigrated.
Right. Colonialism was the norm.
And so his project was really about affirming the value
of those cultures. Right. Against this backdrop of denigration.
He was trying to fight back against this narrative that African cultures were somehow inferior.
Okay, so let's talk about how this African way of knowing manifests itself in aesthetics.
In art.
In art,
So for Singhor, African art was all about rhythm.
Rhythm.
He saw rhythm as this kind of vital force that animates all of creation. And he saw that reflected in the way that African artists use line and form and color.
Right. They're not just trying to imitate nature.
They're trying to capture the essence of life.
The energy.
The movement.
And that's where rhythm comes in.
Rhythm is the pulse of life.
And he really believed that African art had this unique ability to connect us to this deeper reality.
To this vital force.
That underlies all of existence.
And he saw this as a strength, not a weakness.
Right. It wasn't primitive.
It was sophisticated.
It was a different way of seeing it.
And it was a valuable way of seeing.
Now, Césaire had a slightly different take on African art.
He did.
He wasn't as focused on rhythm.
No.
But he also saw art as this really important source of meaning.
Especially in a world that was becoming increasingly secular.
Right.
Where traditional mythologies were losing their power.
Yeah, and he saw art as a way of keeping that sacred flame alive.
Yeah, of connecting to something larger than ourselves.
Now, both Senghor and Césaire were really interested in this idea of the Dionysian.
Oh, yes.
And the Apollonian.
And Nietzsche.
From Nietzsche, right.
The god of wine and revelry.
Right, and the god of order and reason.
And they saw this as a way of understanding the tension between form and freedom in art.
So the Dionysian is like the wild.
The instinctual.
The emotional.
The ecstatic.
And the Apollonian is like the...
Was structured.
The rational.
It's a troll.
And they saw both of these impulses.
Yeah.
As being present in African art.
This is a dynamic interplay.
So it's not just about pure emotion.
Yeah.
It's about how that emotion is shaped and channeled.
Into form.
Into form, right.
It's about finding that balance.
Okay, so now we've talked about emotion.
Yeah.
We've talked about aesthetics. Let's move on to politics.
All right.
Because Négritude wasn't just an abstract philosophy. Yeah. It had real-world implications.
Absolutely.
So how did Négritude thinkers envision political liberation?
Well, for Césaire, political liberation was very much tied to the idea of Black self-determination. He believed that Black people needed to control their own destinies.
Right, they couldn't rely on others.
To liberate them.
To fight their battles for them.
Exactly.
And he was really critical of the European left for not taking the issue of race.
Seriously enough.
Seriously enough, right?
He felt like they were too focused on class and not enough on race.
And so he broke with the French Communist Party.
He did, in a very public way.
Yeah, he wrote this famous letter.
To Maurice Thorez.
To Maurice Thorez, who was the leader of the party.
Yeah.
And he basically said, you're not doing enough to address the specific needs.
Of Black people.
Of Black people, right.
They felt like they were being treated as an afterthought.
Right, like their struggles were just a subset.
Of the larger class.
Of the larger class struggle, right.
And he was like, no, our struggles are unique.
Right.
And they need to be addressed.
And Senghor had his own vision of what he called African socialism.
And this was really interesting. Because he was trying to find a way to reconcile the ideas of socialism with African values.
Right. He wasn't interested.
Yeah.
He just importing
a European ideology.
Wholesale.
He wanted to adapt it.
To the African context.
To the African context.
So he was really emphasizing the communal aspect.
Of socialism.
Of socialism.
The idea of solidarity.
Of sharing.
Cooperation.
And he saw those values. As being already present.
In traditional African societies.
In traditional African societies.
So it was more about building on what was already there.
Than imposing something new.
Exactly.
Okay, so as we wrap up our deep dive into Négritude, I want to ask you, what do you think its lasting legacy is?
Good question.
It was this really powerful movement.
It was.
In the mid-20th century.
It had a huge impact.
On Black thought and culture.
Yeah.
But is it still relevant today?
Well, I think it's important to remember that Négritude was a product of its time.
Right.
And it was responding to the specific challenges.
Of that time.
Of that time, right.
And the world has changed a lot.
Oh, it has.
Since then.
Yeah.
So we can't just uncritically apply the ideas of Négritude
to today's world.
To today's world.
But I think there are still some valuable insights that we can draw from it.
Okay, like what?
Well, for example, the idea of Black self-determination.
Yeah.
The idea that Black people need to have control.
Over their own lives.
Over their own lives.
That's still relevant.
That's still absolutely relevant.
And the idea of celebrating Black culture and identity?
Absolutely.
That's still important.
It's about recognizing the beauty and the value of Blackness.
And challenging those who would try to denigrate it.
Exactly.
And I think another important legacy of Négritude is this idea of a global Black consciousness.
Yeah, that was a really radical idea at the time.
Right. To think about Black people all over the world.
As being connected.
As being connected.
By their shared experiences.
And that idea, I think, continues to inspire
it does.
Movements for social justice.
Yeah.
Solidarity.
And solidarity.
Yeah.
All over the world.
And I think it's interesting to think about how Négritude might evolve.
Yeah.